Okay. Okay, hello. Uh, let's see. I felt like there were several things uh, that I would like to talk about recently. Mm, and one is probably the grip that culture can have on you. Uh, I'm interested by that at the moment. It's probably the way in which culture can um, impose its vision of the world and of how to behave onto you. And and I guess I've always been interested in that and how, there's this idea of culture not being your friend, for example, as Terence McKenna said, right? But I guess that in the Terence McKenna way of seeing things and the way that I'd always seen things, culture is this grip, but it's this grip mm, more or less all the time. It's all the time the same grip. That may not be the case, I just realized, because obviously Terence McKenna's view is very history based. It's very kind of things actually getting more intense as they go along. So maybe like Terence McKenna is not as static in that regard. Uh, but but still, I guess I had this vision of culture being, the black iron prison of Philip K. Dick, but just forever, forever being the same kind of a prison. Mm. And then, to the extent that you can escape from that prison, the grip gets looser, and it can get looser for groups of individuals as well as for individuals. Uh, okay, so that's one way of seeing it, I suppose. That whatever way that culture has some sort of an imposing hegemony kind of creating power over you that stifles individuals, that kind of power is always the same and always there. And recently I'm interested in the way in which maybe it is, in fact, tightening, right? That it isn't the same grip all the time. It's a grip that gets tighter and tighter. And so, at times when perhaps it feels as if you or the world have become a bit, mm, freer from that grip and things have become a bit more relaxed, that grip can still get even tighter and and make things even more difficult. See, the way of talking about this, I think, that is standard is talking about it from the perspective of capitalism. And I think that's why I have become interested in that recently, because it seems like an interesting way to bridge some more shamanic, mystical ideas like what Terence McKenna is talking about, or obviously ideas of samsara in Buddhism, the idea of the world being a world of a tight grip of suffering inherently, right? Those ideas, like samsara in Buddhism, samsara seems to be described purely in its non-historical aspects, just the sort of the eternal way in which circumstances can tend towards a kind of individually limiting situations, ways where individuality is limited. So it describes them in this sort of eternal way. And then the critique of capital describes it in this historical way as a process that begins in a slightly relaxed way and gets worse and worse, gets more and more intense. And I suppose I'm interested in how those two worlds could be united, because there is a sense usually that if you're interested in the critique of capital, you would tend not to see the world in a samsaric way exactly, because seeing it as in a samsaric way or in a Terence McKenna kind of way is first just not a historical way of looking at it, and second, it's an eternal way of looking at things. So it already implies a certain kind of eternality of perspective, because it's talking about the eternality of suffering, and in Buddhism that I think means, you know, of pleasure too. It's the eternality of the cycles of birth and rebirth, which is going into areas of thinking that get very close to a kind of deistic thinking or religious thinking of some sort, right? Because it's touching upon the eternal and the relationship to the eternal that an individual can have. And so the ways in which that relationship is handled in mysticism or in Buddhism are ways that that are in some way very immaterial, you could say, perhaps. They're meditative practices, things that precisely would put you in touch with that eternal side of things, or allow the pieces to fall, allow all of the unnecessary stuff to fall, so that the grip that culture has on you is relaxed by your not kind of keeping that grip on yourself. So the mystical insight seems to be the grip that culture has on you is somehow connected to how you are relating to that world. And so by having some sort of a contemplative practice that organically or naturally reduces that attachment, right, precisely in Buddhism, right, that you're having on the world, it reduces also the grip that the world has on you, and stuff like that. Whereas Marxism seems to be focusing more on which are the actual sort of structures collectively and outside of you that are worsening that grip, that are maintaining it, and how can you as an individual and together collectively with everyone else who is also being affected by this, how can you all do something that actually changes that material sort of circumstance and the relationships precisely between people that are sort of causing that to happen. So it's more focused on I don't know how you would call it, a direct sort of relationship with the outer world, that you're trying to work with that sort of direct relationship. Mm, and I guess, right, so what I was saying is the whole idea of mysticism is too too connected perhaps to individuality or something like that. It's a contemplative practice. It's something you do alone in some ways. Of course, that's it's not entirely true in that most contemplative practices end up creating some sort of a structure around them where the contemplative practice is had together with other people, right? So there are like communities of people who meditate together and things like that. But um, but it deals mainly with ideas in some way because it's about letting go of certain kind of ideas and mental practices and attachments that are causing and perpetuating that structure of tightening. Mm. So, so we have these two worlds. It seems to me there's the historical approach to this of thinking of the tightening grip of culture as something that is happening, and it's happening more and more, and it's happening more and more independently of this eternal state. I think that's sort of it, isn't it? Seeing it in the mystical way of some sort of an eternal state that every individual is related to can make it seem, or it can make you focus on the idea that mm, the grip, the suffering causing situation is somehow inextricably connected to the individual. It can cause that impression, right? It's like the individual is inextricably connected to that thing. And the historical perspective objectifies it. It turns it more into an object. It says people are now in the grip of this thing, but not because it's some eternal situation, because of specific structures, you know? And so we want to focus on those structures. Anyway, but still, I feel as if the two things can be connected. They can be connected. Mm. It's just that the the eternal side of things is very internal, perhaps, and the historical side of things is very external. That's all it is, I think, maybe. So, mm, when when we use the word capitalism, it can seem as if like as if we're referring to something again that is disconnected from that eternal side of things. And I think you can see this clearly because if you were to talk about capitalism and all the kind of structures that it is causing and suffering that it entails. If you were to talk about that from a Buddhist perspective, it would seem as if the word capitalism is some sort of a fake word or just a euphemism for the actual underlying eternal condition of samsara. It would seem as if then talking about capitalism would be a fallacy or a distraction from this sort of deeper cause. And vice versa, if you're talking about samsara or any idea like that, and you're putting that idea in dialogue with Marxism, it would seem as if any idea of samsara or something like that is an idea. And it's an idea that is emerging right now. It's emerging right now in the conversation we're having. Or is being used in a specific way in the kind of conversation we're having, right? And so it is still just the effect of the material conditions that we're in, which are, material conditions created by capitalism. Even if the idea of samsara is older than what we call capitalism, it would still be considered like a specific, something that we're talking about right now, right? It's people right now, like me, who are not in ancient India and China, talking about that word in a specific way now. So it can be seen as a distraction. It can be also seen as a distraction because of its eternal nature. Because of its eternal nature and its focus on ideas, it can seem as if any talk of something like samsara will just redirect the potential for change. It will just redirect it into individual ideological kind of processes. And so, again, samsara becomes just like a fake kind of word or a euphemism for capitalism. It's just a euphemism that turns capitalism into something eternal. And the vice versa position is saying that capitalism is a euphemism which turns samsara into something historical. I think those two categories can coexist. I think that they're just two sides of the same coin in some way. Again, like an internal and an external side of things. For instance, something that comes to mind now is I'm reading this book by I kind of forget their names now. David Graeber and David Wengrow, I think, called A New Dawn, or something like that. It's a sort of a history of humanity from an anthropological perspective, more or less, and an anarchist perspective. But one thing they mentioned that I thought was very interesting, and maybe interesting to this sort of conversation, is that ideas of the state of the world, or that appeal to some sort of an eternal state beyond capitalism. Ideas like, for example, they speak of Hobbes and Rousseau, where Rousseau had more or less the idea that the state of nature was it sort of eternal and good and perfect, but then there is some sort of like an inevitable will pull towards capitalism that destroys that perfect state, and then Hobbes had this similar, like, mirror image idea where the state of nature is terrible, painful, everyone's fighting against everyone, but capitalism, or like the mechanisms of technology and basically the kind of structures that are created once what we consider now capitalism emerge, that those structures are also inevitable and good. I don't know if he said they were inevitable, but he said they were good in any case. So maybe I'm getting lost in this example, this is unnecessary, but I feel as if both of them, Rousseau and Hobbes, were speaking of things that were before the moment that they were in, right? So Hobbes was talking about this state of nature world where everyone's fighting against everyone and everyone's competing, and the authors of this book say, well, it's interesting because the kind of world he's describing, a world where everyone is competing against one another, is in some ways precisely the world that he was living in. He was living in a world of competition. And the authors of this book, citing, anthropological research and archaeological research of different kinds, suggest that in fact there is no proof that all human beings were a specific way in prehistoric days, right? Because the idea that Hobbes would probably be suggesting is that every single human group and every single sort of community of humans in a state of nature situation, which he probably meant like in a whatever pre-agriculture, complex technology kind of era, in a prehistoric sort of setting, that any grouping of human beings, it would be their nature, so a sort of almost like an eternal category, would be their nature to be competing and fighting, right? And the authors of this book say, well, maybe, but there is no data to support this, and in fact all the archaeological and anthropological data suggests that that there are all sorts of different ways in which humans organize themselves, and that, to the authors of the book, makes more sense. It makes more sense to me as well, to think that in fact there are all sorts of different ways in which human beings organize together and create different kinds of societies and different kinds of, and there are different kinds of, there is no sort of baseline state that is of a specific kind. Right, and that's the same token they would use to criticize Rousseau. Let's say Rousseau says that there is some sort of a baseline nature that is good, and let's say no. Again, there is no one way, one sort of hegemony that is applied to all human beings in prehistory. And again, like, if you're going to believe one version over the other, they also would argue that we need to remember that both versions are just as much stories that we're creating based on our archaeological data and stuff of that nature. So there is no, like, the problem is that it's very easy to jump from that idea of it's a story that we are telling ourselves based on the research to thinking that it's some sort of almost a metaphysical fact about reality itself, that somehow reality at its core, at its nature, is a savage place, or that at its core is a beautiful place, or something like that. Right. So there's that. And so, anyway, what what the authors are saying is, it's interesting to suggest that the vision of Hobbes, for example, of the world as this place of pure competition, if it is a fiction, then where is it coming from? What would make him feel that way? Well, probably his life experience, what he's seen. And he has not lived in prehistory. He has lived in a very specific historical period where there was a lot of competition, a lot of savage competition, right? Which is the world of capitalism, where competition is necessary to live. So, ideas like samsara and things like that, I can see why they could be seen as just the same kind of story, as sort of an idea of an eternal world of suffering, that is in some ways simply a myth created by people who are living right now. And again, because I'm speaking of samsara as like the way we're using it now, basically, people who are talking about capitalism. However, again, I feel those two worlds can collide. It's just like the important thing probably is just to not feel embarrassed in using those terms, because that's probably one of the key issues, is that if you're within a Buddhist context and you start talking about capitalism, it may feel embarrassing, because it may feel as if you're going against the tradition. The tradition is telling you, no, don't focus on these historical causes, focus on the eternal causes. And if you're speaking about samsara from a Marxist context, it may feel embarrassing because it seems as if you're giving way to fantasies that don't focus on the historical process. But somehow, the thing is that I feel they are connected. They are like the issue here is that somehow we feel they are connected. I think we all somehow feel they're connected. You can see this in the way in which Marxist critique or anti-capitalist, post-capitalist critiques of capitalism after Marx, like in recent decades, they tend to be texts that more and more extend the power of capitalism into more and more areas, right? So we end up talking about how capitalism is affecting very small, subtle details of how we think, of how we behave, of how our world is organized or appears to us, right? And it's a sort of critique that ends up, I feel, giving a sort of almost divine power to capitalism, the kind of divine power that something like samsara would have. And so I feel as if probably the same thing happens from within Buddhism, although I'm not that familiar, I think, with what Buddhists say today, what mystics say today, but I feel as if perhaps there is also a way in which the way we talk about samsara can end up becoming more and more historical, to the point where it seems like what we're talking about is capitalism. I feel like that is probably also happening. Probably like one way in which this is happening, perhaps, is in the use of the concept of awakening, right? Because it seems as if in an eternal kind of perspective on awakening, awakening is not something that happens historically. It doesn't happen to you in a specific moment in time. It doesn't happen to a group of people in a specific moment in time. And yet, maybe, and again, I'm not that familiar with this world, but maybe modern modern spirituality, let's put it that way, tends to really focus on the historical aspect of enlightenment, even at a collective level. Like, in a sense, when you think about it, this is what happens with a lot of what is commonly called the New Age, right? That the idea of an awakening is seen as something that will happen historically at a specific moment. And so it historicizes samsara, basically. So I think this historicization of samsara draws the spiritual conversation closer to sort of capitalist critique, and the eternalization of capital in Marxist critique draws it closer to what we usually call samsara. I feel like both discussions are heading in these contrary ways that are biting each other's tails. And so I feel, again, as if recently I've been really noticing this way in which the grip is getting stronger, and this is a historical process. It's like the structures through which hegemony is constantly force fed on everyone within it are stronger and stronger. Like, there are faster and faster marketing and publicity tricks, sort of more efficient, more subtle ways in which ideas of a hegemonic quality get sort of thrown into individuals again and again. So the battle is getting stronger in some ways, and at the same time, precisely because of that, I think it's maybe becoming harder and harder to see it in terms that don't bring synchronicity into it, or that don't bring any kind of a mystical perspective into it. I think that the thing is, if you don't bring a mystical perspective into it, it means you're really desperately trying to find sort of cause and effect, causal reasons for the tightening. And at some point I feel as if, especially when synchronicity comes into play, that's where conspiracy thinking enters, right? The kind of, and when I say conspiracy thinking, I mean it in the cultural way in which it is used as a sort of extreme paranoid kind of thinking, where suddenly the causes for the tightening grip are a sort of superhuman effort on the part of specific evil people. Right? And on the other hand, like, the kind of thinking that doesn't quite fall into that sort of a... So there is that sort of paranoid thinking where the locus of the of capitalism is a specific group of people, so it's not a systemic effect. Or there is, I think, also a way in which paranoia can try to be articulated in a systemic way, but what that ends up saying is it's the system that is doing this, but as the grip gets tighter and the effects become more deeply rooted, I think that it becomes difficult not to talk about it as if it were some sort of a living being, right? I think that it becomes difficult to talk about capitalism without it feeling as if what we're talking about is some sort of a system or a presence that has the qualities of life within it. And I think that that's the thing, because what the mystical perspective does, the good thing about the mystical perspective is that it bridges those two gaps, because it says, that the outer world and the inner world are connected. And so the life that you see in capitalism is not disconnected from your own inner world. It doesn't mean that your inner world is causing it. And it doesn't, obviously it doesn't mean the opposite either. It just means that there is some sort of a union between them. I think that serves as a defense against paranoia in some way. Because no matter how miraculous or incredible the tightening grip of the world becomes, the need to find specific cause and effect reasons for it becomes sort of less of a life or death issue. Because like in a Buddhist sense, you can see that it's co-originating. There is a co-origination of all these things. Right? You don't necessarily need to find an origin, a locus from where it's coming. Especially when, again, the interconnection between all these effects starts getting so intense that it approaches the experience of synchronicity. Because if the experience of synchronicity is approached and there is no mystical perspective, then that experience just gets lost. You can't, like, if you try to express a causal event, an experience of a causality through causal means, you will get lost. So that's why I think it's the mystical perspective is important for capitalism. And I think the mystical perspective, happily for Marxism, is a material practice. That's the funny thing about it. Like it literally is a. It's not an idea, right? Because a lot of what Marxism is afraid of in these sorts of things is that these things are ideas, right? Samsara is an idea, nirvana is an idea. But the thing is that mysticism would agree with that, because the whole point is that it's a practice. It's a practice. It's a contemplative practice, in this sense. And so, a contemplative practice is not a set of ideas and beliefs that you have about the world. In a sense, it's almost like the opposite. But it's not even the opposite, because it can't work in that opposite sort of framework. But in some manner of speaking, it is the opposite, because it's contemplation is the practice, throughout a long period of time of being in a state in which thoughts calm down. And paranoia is a state in which thoughts become very agitated and really want to find some sort of a solution to the problem that they're dealing with, right? I think some sort of a mystical practice is a state in which precisely, right, again, happily for Marxism, it is a state in which thought plays less of a role somehow. It embodies the being, right, into an individual that can do things. That's the paradox, because it's a practice of non-doing, but it empowers doing. I think that's why it's important for this, because right from a Marxist perspective, we wouldn't be talking about some sort of an eternal state of samsara. We're talking about a historical process that is getting more and more intense, that is reaching, whose inner contradictions of capitalism are getting more strained. So from that perspective, from a perspective that is looking at things in that way, you can see how at some point something is going to be necessary to hold that perspective, to allow it not to collapse. And I think that is mystical practice in some way. And mystical practice doesn't need to be like a specific thing. I think we can theorize about it further. Like it doesn't really need to be, I think, a daily meditative practice or something like that. Like I think it might even be good that it is that, in the same way that it is good for us to eat healthily and things like that. Like, yeah, sure, like maybe a daily meditative practice is something that could be recommended. However, I feel like it goes a little bit beyond that. It's about I think at the core it's about non-doing, and I think non-doing enters into our life in all sorts of ways. I think like a practice of non-doing can enter into different people's lives in different ways. So anyway, so that's that. But then the other side of the coin, right, is exactly, it's the other perspective, which is that for Buddhism, it is equally important to keep a sort of a historical perspective, let's say, because from what I've read, a lot of communities of monks in the past would often how would I say it, really give a lot of importance to the meditative practice, to the contemplative practice. And of course, the contemplative practice, it has traditionally, been easier to do for people in calm environments where there is no direct material insufficiency or threat. And so, if there was war in your country, you would go to the mountains and meditate in the mountains. You would go to the desert and meditate and contemplate in the desert. I think that even in the case of Zen, from what I've heard, it was very typical for Zen monasteries to try to stay friendly. They would stay friendly with whoever was in power, basically. So, right, if if this person was in power, they'd be friendly with this. If this person was in power, they'd be friendly with whoever, in order to maintain the material circumstances that would allow them to continue to meditate. So of course that's interesting, because sure, it's placing a lot of importance on the meditative practice, but surely that is lacking some piece of the puzzle, I think. Surely some sort of a historical perspective would see, because it's good to talk about samsara in an eternal sense, but how do I say it? I think there are ways also in which to prevent Buddhism or meditative practice from simply aiding or working in the same direction as hegemony. Because I feel like hegemony is the kind of thing that worsens the sorts of conditions that Buddhism is fighting against by meditating, right? When Buddhism or meditative practice is trying to let go of attachments to specific objects of fear and specific objects of desire, hegemony is the strong perpetuation of this is what you should desire, this is what you should not desire. This is the correct way in which a family should organize itself. This is not the correct way. This is the correct way in which an individual should be. This is the correct way in which men should be. This is the correct way in which women should be, and so on. All those things are intense strengthenings of attachments to specific objects of desire and objects of fear. So I think it's also illusory to say, well, but it's an eternal sort of state. So regardless of what is happening right now in my historical moment, I will focus on just trying to meditate as much as I can and improve the world in that way. If that distracts you from the ways in which perhaps you are directly collaborating with capitalism, then I think that something is needed there to balance out the meditative practice. And I think that is some sort of a historical perspective and a historical some sort of an actual practice of doing, a practice of doing that is not a practice of non-doing, let's say, or not even a practice, right? Maybe it needs to be even more dialectically opposed. It's not a non-doing practice, it's a doing instance, which again is not disconnected from Buddhism and from meditation. Because the whole idea, that's why I think that's precisely why both things go together. That's exactly why both things go together. Because meditation aids right action. That's precisely the Buddhist concept, is to be present enough that you can act in the correct way in every given circumstance, so that there isn't a hegemony of behavior where we must behave in this specific way in these instances and in this specific way in these other instances. No, Buddhism says, no, in this present moment, this is the best way to act is this one. And it's something that is not born from ideas, but it's born from practice. It's born from a practice of non-doing. Again, a practice of non-doing aids in instant doing, in doing that is the best kind of doing for any specific instance. So it's not a practice in that way. So that is deeply connected. And then again, with how a historical or like Marxist perspective on capitalism is an analysis that ends up in some ways going into mystical terrains. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I think the grip is tightening. I think that's important to keep in mind, and I think that that's why it's important to keep on thinking about it and to keep on talking about it, because it is a grip of ideas, simultaneously as it is also a grip of material structures and social relations, which are material relations as well, in some way. So it is a grip of ideas. It's the grip of the ideas of what is an object of desire, what isn't, So I think it does need to be continually fought from an idea-based place. At the same time as it has to be a direct sort of acts taken in the present moment. And yeah, not sure what else to say about this, so that's probably the end of this video. So yeah, thank you for listening, and we'll, I don't know, see each other soon.